Father, you are the author of history, and you have it for a purpose. They are just random events that take place in time. You purposed them before eternity past. Before there ever was, it is a point in time when you said it is good and you started to make your creation. You already had a plan for that creation and where it was going, how it would endure, and then where it would end. And we are a definite part of that history. So, Father, we come to you today wanting you to speak to us through history, through these people who lived thousands of years ago, and through the events that took place, they worked in their lives, and you taught them things about you. We want you to work in our lives and teach us things about you. So I pray that through your prophets, through this history of your people Israel, that you would teach us as the church, as those who are your bride, what it means to serve a God who is holy, who is love, who is compassion, who is grace, who is mercy, and yet has wrath as well. He judges as well. You are a God who judges, but just. There are so many pictures of who you are in this study. I just pray, Father, that you will just highlight them, and that we will walk away closer to you and being different people and less tied to this world than we were before. May you be exalted, may you be glorified, our hearts being blessed and our lives be changed because of the study of the minor prophets. Thank you for this privilege. Thank you for this church. Thank you for these women. Thank you for the ability to learn new things that have to be spiritually discerned because you give them to the Holy Spirit. Thank you for your presence here. We bless you now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, I wasn't going to start at the beginning, but I guess that'd be natural. There were so many avenues of direction I wanted to go with this, and that it's really hard. And because there's so much here, and there's so much to be gleaned from it. But if you are not somebody who is familiar with the Old Testament, I don't want to confuse you either. And that's why to jump into an Old Testament study, like I said, it's kind of right in the middle of the Old Testament. Many times we hear, the stories of Abraham, and we hear Moses, and we hear Joseph, and we hear all those stories. And then we talk about the prophets, but we really have no idea what those prophets were doing or why they were there or why they were significant. But they take up a major portion of the Old Testament, and they are quoted numerous times in the New Testament. I just heard a thing on the radio that yesterday, I think it was a guy was giving a sermon, and he said the Old Testament is either directly quoted or referenced or assumed at least 400 times. I think it might be more than that. And that Jesus quotes the Old Testament 90 times in the New Testament. So the concept of thinking that we can just study the New Testament, we're all good, is a fallacy. Because there's too much of the New Testament that is contained there because of the Old Testament. So we definitely want to make this relevant to your life today. And it will be, because the way that they were living their lives and the messages of prophets, if we have prophets today, they are saying exactly the same things to us if we had prophets that were sent to us as Israel did. But before I get to this kind of flyover of the history of the Jews, in order to understand where the prophets fit in that program, I wanted again to have you recognize that the whole point of this is that God speaks in history, and you can see that at the top of your lecture notes. As I think about this, as I've thought about this over the last several months, it never ceases to amaze me that God started time at a particular point. God is not in time. He is outside of time. But he said, I'm gonna take this little section right here, thousands of years, and I'm gonna stick it in my program. And I'm gonna have people living in that. I'm gonna plan it, and I'm gonna have a history that goes on and interactions. And I'm gonna teach my people something as I do that. And that to me is fascinating, that all of history is literally God telling us something. There is no time in history when God goes telling us something, because history is God telling this story. That's why people call it his story. That's what it is. It's all from the very beginning to the very end. It's always God speaking. That's why as a teacher, my students try to tell me, why do you need to know this? Well, you don't want to say that to me at best. And I tell them, you don't have to know this. We don't. No, you get to. That's the way I see it. You get to know it. What they have to understand is whether you're talking about Hitler in World War II, or whether you're talking about the Moses coming out of Egypt, or whether you're talking about the Twin Towers, it's all God's story in history. And for some reason, he wrote it exactly the way he did. And there's times when I read it and I go, what? What was that about? I did what? Why in the world do I need to know that Dinah got raped? And that just depresses me, is all that does. And yet we know God doesn't do anything without a reason. Everything he says is valuable and pertinent and is something we need to know because it clarifies to us who we are and who he is. And so God speaks in history, and I just wanted you to see these three things that I specifically think is God's reasons. These are only three of them. We'll talk about other ones, but these are the ones I want you to see first of all. Before we get into the prophets, God is speaking in history, number one, to reveal himself to us. It is crazy to me that we had a whole section of history where we had leaders of our nation who believed that God created and then stepped back and never involved himself in creation anymore. Those were deists. That's what Thomas Jefferson was. That's what many of the founding fathers were, that yes, God's power created the world, but God does not personally interact into the world after that. So he went about cutting out a whole bunch of stuff that happened because he didn't think that God would have done that. But that's that. Why didn't God speak about history if it wasn't something we needed to know? He is not just writing to write. He didn't write this book and give it to people just for the heck of it, just like a journal. I think I'll write my journal. No, it's his letter to us. It's his information to us about how he creates, who he creates, what he does to create, how he feels about his creation, what his holiness, how it responds to that creation. That's what it's all about. He did it to reveal himself to us. I am so distressed about the fact that today we live in a church that is indulged in Bibles, and yet they rarely read it. Or if they do, they read it one verse at a time. Let's just do one verse, and we're going to talk about them. We'll tell a bunch of stories about it, but we're just going to do that verse in that, and we're not going to put it in this context. We're just we like that verse because it applies to what we're teaching. And not that there's not a place in it sometimes, but that is not the way Scripture should be taught. Because it's an ongoing letter. It's an ongoing revelation. We call the last book of the Bible Revelation, but it's all the revelation of Jesus Christ from the first word in the beginning to the end. And it is the revelation of Jesus Christ and God revealing himself through that. So first thing he does when he speaks in history is to reveal it to us. So we can't say, and even though history sometimes seems boring, it's not significant. It is important because that's his story. That's what he wants us to know. Number two, it's to instruct us in his holiness. I think he started that right with creation. Right at the point of creation, that's why he said it's good. This is good, and this is very good. And then he even rested on the Sabbath because he wanted us to, he started to illuminate to us the kind of God he is, right from the very beginning. And I don't know about you, but I cannot go out and look at, like we were up to St. Joe this last week, and the leaders had a feeding at Darlos Lake River Cabin. You can't drive up that road and not just go, whoa. I mean, seriously, it will move you to the core because of the colors, the water, the mountains, the sky, all of it. It's just like, oh my goodness. It is so, and it does something intrinsically to us as human beings because God speaks even in his creation. Everything he does speaks. He's not a God who does not want to be known. He fully wants to be known. The question is, do we want to know him? That's the only question. And you're here because you do. And that's awesome. That's why we're here. So he wants to instruct us in who he is in everything he says and everything he does. He's revealing himself as the God of the universe. Now, I could go on for about half an hour just on what it's like to think about God. I mean, seriously, have you ever like really done that? Like, really thought about who he has to be? I mean, like, right now who he has to be holding the universe in its entirety together. He's doing that on a consistent basis, everywhere, every second, all the time. And when we drop this body, we are basically going to be in the presence of that power. Like I said, that would be my favorite subject if we could talk about that for a while. I don't think sometimes we even think about how marvelous, how magnificent, how mind-boggling God has to be. Just in the little bit around us when he makes a drop in the bucket compared to the universe. So he wants us to know that. He wants us to see that. But the only way we can see it is if we first know he's holy, right? That's the first thing we have to know about him. He's holy. And that's why I think he has to instruct us in holiness. And we're going to see that when we look at the history of Israel. That was his goal when he met with Israel and when he taught them. Number 3 is to identify to us where we go wrong so we can learn from it. You will find in the prophets over and over and over again, the prophets are simply saying, and God said, stop it. Stop it. Don't do that anymore. I cannot have fellowship with you when you are involved in things that are unholy. I am too holy for that. He is not just a God up there trying with a big stick, trying to beat us into conceding to what he wants us to do. He is like, no, I created you for a purpose, and I am who I am. And the only way you're going to find out who I am and find out who you are and be the best of that is to understand my holiness. It cannot be taken for granted. And that's what happened in the prophets, that we'll see in multiple ways. So he's going to reveal himself there in multiple ways. Okay, I have a whole bunch of stuff from Genesis and stuff that I'd like to go over. I think I'm going to save that for next week, just so that I can fly through this history of the Jews from Abraham to the end. And I'm going to do this very quick, simply because some of it is going to be repeated in your first lesson to give you an idea of where the prophets fit in this history of the Old Testament. Because sometimes we don't understand the significance of why they were there and how they got there, then they really don't mean anything to us. So we're going to just very quickly go back over that. So some of you, I would hope everybody here could do this. I would everybody here can give an overview of the Old Testament and understand its progression. Maybe by the time I'm done here, that will be the way it is. Because that's really what I'm to see in order to understand the significance of all of it. So let's just start then. We're going to start, and I notice that I'm starting with Abram. I didn't even start with creation, because I've already talked about creation. And I didn't start with Noah, because remember, once they all sinned and went crazy, he wiped them out, and then he started over with Noah. And when he started over with Noah, remember, again, we've talked about this numerous times, but we have to go back to the Genesis 3:15 promise. God promised Adam and Eve when they fell, and he told Satan the curse. I'm going to, out of the seed of the woman, there's going to be a seed of the woman. Women don't have seeds, by the way. Right? The seed of the woman means a male person from the woman is going to, and the seed of the woman obviously would be God's seed, it would come right down to her because you know who that seed is down. He's going to crush the head of the serpent. And then the serpent's going to bite his heel. So it's going to be a deadly attack with some wounding going on. The seed is going to be wounded, but Satan is going to be crushed. And that was given clear back in Genesis 3:15, which is very interesting because then God eventually has to just destroy the whole world. What good is it to have the promise of a seed that's going to come and rescue everyone through this problem that we have now that you've got sin in your life and you can't fix it? What good is that? I'm going to wipe everybody out. Well, he didn't, did he? He didn't wipe everybody out. Who did he keep? He kept Noah. So we know that the seed of the woman is going to come through Noah, which Noah had 3 sons. And later on, we'll break that all down eventually. But we'll talk about that eventually. But in this particular one, I want to jump forward to one of the offspring of Shem was Abram. And Abram lived in the land of Sur. Do we have that map, friend? I don't know if you can get that up there or not. What? Yeah. The one that shows the First Crescent and that, yeah. So you can see down here where it says the Persian Gulf, and you guys, I put a today kind of map just so you could kind of relate to where Abraham was from. Do you have the one that shows Sumer on it? And Abraham's sign as well? Nope, not that one. Nope. I think there have been three, but this is one we're going to see where the tribes are split. You go back to them at one day. Okay, so you can see down here where it says Iraq and said the Persian Gulf. Right at there, remember it says Basra. You guys have heard of that because of the Iraqi war. Ur of the Chaldees, or Sumer, is where Abraham was from, and so he was from that area. And you can see that little section right there is called the Fertile Crescent, all the way to the Persian Gulf, up and around, and then all the way around the desert right there, Saudi Arabia, and then down into where Israel is at. It is crescent. It's just like a crescent. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. And because of the rivers that are there, it is fertile. It grows crops well. Of course, we know that is the Euphrates and the Euphrates, and then the I still find Tigris. Thank you. Wow, couldn't see it. So we got these two rivers that are there, creating kind of that fertile area. They say, well, Abraham was down from that area, and you could see right above there where it says Iraq. So today, that is Iraq. And that is where Abraham was from. And he was a Sumerian, is really what it would be, because he was from the area of Sur. That was called Sur at the time. And right above Sur, where it's in Basra, up by where it's in Baghdad, that would be Babylon. And then when you get farther up to where it says Mosul, that would have been some of the Assyrian territory, which we're going to talk about, because you've got all these different countries that eventually take over Israel, and they take them into captivity. So you'll need to know those areas. And then back where it hangs is the Zagros Mountains, that's kind of the area of Persia. So you'll have Persian kings that are going to, all of them just take over each other one time or another. And that's how eventually Abraham's offspring end up back over in that land again. They're going to end up back there. So just wanted you to have a visual of that. But on your first blank, we have Abram is from Babylonia or Sur. He went from there to Canaan. You can call it Babylonian Sur, is where it was many, many, many years before. That area was kind of segmented into some different nations. And so either Sumer or Babylonia, you're going to be right. It does matter. It's Mesopotamia as on the whole. The whole area is called Mesopotamia. So then that starts in Genesis chapter 12, because remember, Abram is called by God and says, I'm going to give you a land and I'm going to give you a people, right? That's when he says that where Abram was from in that land of Sumer, they were very pagan people. So he came from that kind of people, but he was called out. And he went to the top of the Fertile Crescent. They stopped in Haran because his father was with him and his father was ill. So they stayed there till his father died. And that's where he got the call then to go on into Canaan. And because God's going to give him a land and make him a great nation. Now remember, at this point, he has no children. He's married, but he has no children. And so then I'm just going to jump from stories that kind of carry that idea through. So then we have the promised child Isaac that arrives when he gets down into the promised land. And they are too old to have children. So you remember the story where she gets him, Sarah gives him her handmaiden, Hagar, was going to say, hey, I come to him, too much of the prophets. And they had Ishmael. But Ishmael is not the promised child. Okay, but that's where our confusion comes in today as to where the strife between Israel and many of the Arab nations around it. But we have Isaac, who is the promised child. And remember, seed of the woman, we're looking for the seed of the woman that's going to come and crush the head of the serpent. So we know that through Shem's son, Abraham, or its offspring, his son, now Abraham is son with the promise from God and the covenant. Next week, I hope to go over that covenant fully so you'll see exactly what happened there, because that plays into what happened with the prophets. We have Isaac's son, Jacob, then escapes to Haran. Now, after they come back down, then he has his children. Remember, Jacob steals the birthright, so he runs up to Haran. He goes back to Haran where Abraham's family is. And so he stayed there and gets a wife, and that's all of those stories. I got the chapters there if you ever want to go back. But some of you should be tracking with me as far as the basic timeline, what's going on here. Then we have Jacob's sons are born in Haran, and remember he has 12 of them. And then eventually he returns to Canaan in chapter 31 in Genesis. And then when he's there, his favored son, Joseph, gets sold into Egypt, right? But we will talk about that next week. The original covenant that God made with Abraham, he told him, this is again what I mean by history. God told Abraham, your offspring will go into captivity for 400 years, and I will send and get them, and I will bring them out to give them life. So God, that was part of God's plan ahead of time. God planned them to be in captivity in Egypt. That was part of the historical plan. He told that to Abraham several generations before it actually happened. So we know he intended for that to happen. He wanted them to go into captivity in Egypt. That's part of his deal. Okay, that wasn't just an event that happened by chance. We might think that, except for that God told Abraham that's what's going to happen before it ever happened. So we know that God intended for that. So we can learn something from that as well. Why did God want them to go into captivity in Egypt? We'll talk about all that when we get into the prophets. So he's sold into Egypt in chapter 37, and then eventually he reveals himself to his brothers, and they all move into Egypt with Jacob and his family in chapter 46. That's how they get to Egypt. That fulfills that prophecy that God gave to Abraham a couple of years before that. So then we jump to the fact that we have Moses is born. Now we're getting into Exodus. We've pretty much covered Genesis. And as far as the historical events, the major events that take place, always in the background, you're thinking the seed. We're looking for the seed, right? They're looking for the seed that's going to crush it out of the serpent. So it's getting narrowed down all the time. Every time you get a new person, it's getting narrowed down as to who that's going to be, or which family it's going to be from. At this point, we know it's going to be from Abraham, and we know it's going to be from Isaac, right? So we know it's going to go from there. So it's going to then come through Jacob. So Moses was born, and he leads the Israelites out of Egypt from Exodus chapter 2 to Deuteronomy 34. And then Joshua takes over, because we have the book of Joshua. Once they get into the land, once they're back into the land. Now remember, some of them were out in the desert for 40 years. I thought it was interesting. I heard something the other day, and I probably shouldn't say this right now, but it was, maybe it's because it just struck me personally. But I thought it was interesting that God specifically told them, you're going to stay you're going to wander out of the desert for 40 years because you didn't believe what I already showed you. I showed you when I did all the miracles in Egypt, when I overcame the Egyptian gods, when I overcame the Egyptian army, when I split the sea, when I provided you manna, when I provided you quail, when I did all the things in the desert that you needed. I showed you what it was. And yet you get to this land, and you send out to 12, and you say, oh, no, they're way too big for us. We can't do this. He said in the day that saved the dead is because they didn't believe what he had originally done and transferred it historically to what was happening that day. Right? Do you get what I'm saying? That's what history is about. And I just thought, wow, if we don't learn from history, that's what we do. That's what happens. So that generation did not get the promised land because God had showed them who he was. And when the time came for them to claim this promise, they said, we can't believe it. It's too hard. It's too scary. That's me. I don't know about you, but I get scared of what's going around in this world right now. And so he said, if you can't believe me after all that I've shown you, then you just walk around this desert and you stay here. I didn't say that just. I only go with the promise I did. So I just thought, wow, that's an interesting lesson to learn. And they specifically said that. I'm going to let you stay here because you did not believe me. I showed you and you didn't believe me. So believing God and trusting God is pretty important through history, especially. So then on the rule number 3, Joshua leads the Israelites into the promised land. Because remember, Moses hit the rock, and so he didn't get to go in. He got to see it, but he didn't get to go in. So Joshua's going in, and in the first place they go, they take, Jericho, the walls fall down, God provides again, shows them, and he's there to conquer their enemies, and he's promised that too. We're going to talk about that next week, because it is really pretty astounding when you look at what he promised to do for them, after what he'd already done for them, and the fact that they didn't believe it. And I think that's where we are right now. I think we're kind of in a place, especially in the church, where we quit believing that God does what he said he's going to do. And we need to learn from that. So the promised land then is divided among the 12 tribes in Joshua. They get into the land and they're supposed to conquer the Canaanites, the Hittites, all of those ites, because they're bad. And God specifically says, I'm not bringing you in here because you're great or because I think you're wonderful, but I want these people wiped out and I'm going to use you to do it. And so I want you to go in and obey me and do this because I'm holy. I don't want these people in my land. And then when I have you in my land, I want you to be holy in the land. So they go in and they take some of the land. They didn't take it all. But then they started dividing the land into the 12 tribes, which are the 12 sons of Jacob, right? There was only 11 that were given because the Levites got a portion in every tribe because they were the priests. So there's going to be, it's broken really into 11. It ends up to be 12 in the fact that Joseph's two sons, remember Joseph's two sons get the double portion. So one of them takes over what the Levites would have eventually have as far as the division is concerned. So Joshua 1, they go into the land, they're divided in Joshua 13 through 22. Then all of a sudden we have spiritual decline going on. They moved into the land, but they haven't wiped out the wicked people. So what happens? They start to take on the wicked people's ways. Does that sound familiar? I hope so, because that's what's happening. They're taking on their ways, even though God warned them. I'm not just a mean God who wants to wipe these people out. There's evil here. You have to purge the land of the evil, or it will infiltrate your ranks, because basically you're sinners too, right? So your tendency is toward that evil. You got to get it out. You got to purge it out. So the spiritual decline begins when we have the time of the judges. So the number 3, there's the rise of the judges, and that's in Judges 3 through 9. And then we get all the craziness of all that goes on within Judges. Nobody likes to read the Judges because of all the dumb stuff that goes on. And but all that is different sections of the land, different areas, and different particular tribes are being attacked by some of the people they left in the land. So they're trying to protect themselves. So they're raising up a judge who will lead them. You're not going to have a king, right? So they've got to stand an army because God is their king and he is the army, supposedly. As long as they do what he chose it to do, he will go before them and wipe out the nations. Well, they didn't. And so now we've got trouble from all around us, and we're kind of taking on the pagan, especially the Philistine. Many of the judges were fighting the Philistines. That would be your Samson stories and things like that. So they cry out to one person that says, can you lead us against these bad people? Well, remember, the judges are only taking place in the small areas. They're not covering all of the 12 tribes and all of the area, protecting them all. They're just rising up in certain areas wherever they happen to find a leader and where they happen to have some of the Hittites or the Philistines or whoever they were attacking them. So that is, and if you've ever read the Judges, you know that you can see the spiritual decline. Even in the Judges, really, have you read Samson? Oh my goodness. So we've got these judges are not doing what God told them to do, but they're trying to get them to protect them, which is what God had promised to do. They have the ministry of Samuel. Now, what you realize is Samuel is really one of the first major prophets. He is not one of the minor prophets, but he was in the land and be one of their prophets before the actual minor prophets rose up. The minor prophets were for a different reason than what Samuel was. So we have Samuel coming in, trying to lead the people spiritually, trying to tell them what God says, and yet the pagan nations around them have overtaken their villages and their culture, and now it's just really looking back. And we'll talk about some of that as we get further on. So then, because it started to get so bad after all of the judges failed to do what they wanted them to do, they said, we want a king. Everybody remembers that, right? And their first king was Saul. So God gave them a king. Samuel was disgusted with them that they wanted a king because he knew that's idol worship. You are replacing God with a man, which you're trying to do with the judges, but now you're going to do it over your whole nation because God isn't sufficient for you. You don't think he's your protector. You don't think he's good enough to stand up against these armies that are coming against you. When really what happened to Jericho? Just march around the multiple down. No, they forgot. They forgot their history. They forgot what God had said and what he promised them. And so we want a king. So God gives them a king. Let's see how this works out for you. Not so well. So Saul is made king in 1 Samuel chapter 10. And then, of course, we know the whole story of how he went out to David, tried to kill him, he actually went in and offered an offering when he was supposed to. So he was actually unholy as well. And so God took the kingdom away from him and said, I'm going to give it to someone else as a man after my own heart, which was David. Unexpected out of all of his brothers, he was not the one they expected to do, because he was he was the one who took care of the sheep. He was the shepherd. He was not the soldier. So he was the one they expected. But he became king in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And then we know, we put a lot of stories about David. We don't have time both, but I just want you to see the progression. Again, we're still looking for the seed, right? Now God makes the covenant with David, so we know it's now going to come down through David's line. And that's where it's going, that promised seed's going to come. Then we have Solomon, David dies, and Solomon becomes king. And Solomon, of course, is the wisest man in the world, richest. The kingdom, the nation of Israel is prospering right now. Building projects, money, gold, other nations, conquering other nations. There's just all kinds of things going on because of the success of Solomon, until, what did he do? He got caught up with the nation, got caught up with the foreign wives, started serving other gods, and things started to crumble. But in the meantime, he expands the nation and builds the temple. Because remember, David was a man of war. So he got all the equipment ready for Solomon to build it. And then Solomon actually built the temple. Well then, trying to make a long story shorter, Solomon dies in 1 Kings 11. This is where, right there, the next point is where the minor prophets are going to come in. This is where I had to take you through that, just to let you see why the minor prophets are significant. Brian, can you put up the map with the divided kingdom? So on growing in those 7 of Rehoboam becomes king. He is the son of Solomon. You know, Solomon had 700 wives, and so we know he had a lot of kids. But as far as we know, Jeroboam's the only one that's listed. There's 2 others that they refer to, but we don't. Rehoboam, was his son, and the other ones are not mentioned. But Rehoboam becomes king, and the people revolt in 1 Kings because they say, because of all the building projects, all the money, and all of the wars that are going on with Solomon, the people are oppressed, the taxes, and they're going into war, and all those kinds of things. So they're like, can you please just ease up on us? You've got too much pressure on us as people. Could you, now that you're king, go build a fire out? And then he says, I'll let me talk to my friends. That was his first mistake. So he talks to his young friends, and his young friends are like, a lot of them think you're soft. You want to be even harder than David is. So he warned them, no, I'm not going to get something fast. I'm going to be much, much harder on you than David that Solomon ever was. I am going to expect even more things. You thought he is harsh. You wait with me. And so the people revolted. Rightly so, right? Remember at this point that all of the 12 tribes are unified into one nation at this point. But when this happens and the people revolt, there's a man who worked for Solomon, actually, by the name of Jeroboam. And Jeroboam is kind of an official was an official Solomon, so he's got some clout. And but he's working for that for Solomon and his son. He's working for them. So we got Rehoboam becomes king, and then Jeroboam is now made king, because when the people revolt, Jeroboam steps up and says, okay, if you want to revolt against Rehoboam, follow me. See, our biggest problem is going to sound alike, right? It's really hard to tell the difference between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. But the only way I usually remember it is that Solomon starts with Manasseh, Rehoboam starts with Ar. So Ar, those two are close. Jeroboam's completely off. So Jeroboam goes to the north, and the kingdom divides. You can see that under where Jeroboam made king. And we have Judah and Benjamin and the south. We see the mapping in prayer. Sorry, being musically before we filled in lights. See, if we see how the light above Benjamin is, and you can see Judah below that. So we have Judah and Benjamin. Now, Simeon was only engulfed in Judah, but as far as we know from history, most of the Simeonites must have gone with the 10 tribes, because they're always dividing those 2 nations now into the southern kingdom, which is Judah and Benjamin, and they call it Judah, and the northern kingdom, which is the 10 tribes of the west. And that would include Simeon. Even though Simeon's land is down in Judah, I believe they went up with the rest of the 10 tribes. And you've probably heard of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. It will be those tribes eventually when we get into what happened when they were taken into Assyria. You'll see how they became the supposed 10 lost tribes. And so that's the division. So now this is how we're broken into the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. Yes. They are all they're on the upright. They let half of them stay on one side and half of them stay on the other. So those are all included. That's really one tribe, but they split it on one side of the river and the other side. And they all go with the 10. So that's where the kingdom splits. And now we have Judah is the southern part of it. And when we go into the prophets, when you go into the kings and the chronicles, it's where you start talking about the kings of the southern kingdom and the kings of the northern kingdom. Jeroboam takes them south, and he puts out to the north, puts up two things. That's just keep happening here. Two golden calves in two different cities. We'll look at those later. To keep that 10 tribes from wanting to go down to Jerusalem to worship God. So he sets up idol worship in the northern kingdom. That is why the northern kingdom is really, it doesn't have one single good king, not a single one. And you'll have those are on the website now, being copied. It shows the different kings and when they served in the southern kingdom, when they served in the northern kingdom. So the first part of studying the minor prophets is going to be the minor prophets to the northern kingdom. The prophets that we first studied, the most of them are warning the northern kingdom because they're so wicked. This will make more sense once you get into the lessons. I just wanted to give an overview, but you'll go back, or she said that, or that showed that on the map. In fact, most of your Bibles probably had that in the back of your Bibles. So the first prophets we're going to be studying are prophets to the northern kingdom. And it won't be until after the Babylonian exile and then after they return that we get back to Judah's prophets. Judas, it was like 150 years between when the southern kingdom or the northern kingdom went into captivity in Assyria to where then finally the Babylonians took over the southern kingdom. So there's a lot of time essence that goes on in these as well. So now we have Jeroboam, the kingdom divides, Judah and Benjamin in the south, and the other 10 in the north called Israel. That's now the nation of Israel up there, and to the south they're called Judah, and that would be Judah. And that's why it gets confusing too when you're reading it. And it sounds like they're talking about the same thing, and they're not. They're talking about the two different kingdoms. And then, as I said, Jeroboam sets up temples in Bethel and Dan to discourage worship in Jerusalem. And then we have the next prophets who are not part of our minor prophet study. That will be Elijah and Elisha. During that time, immediately after this split, Elijah and Elisha are prophets to the northern kingdom, who is sufficiently evil. All of that, you will see this as we go along. And then the northern kingdom, Israel, had wicked kings that led the people into further sin. Very quickly, I'm going to let you go here. I just want to finish this one section. So on the back, you had number 5, the warning of God's judgment from the minor prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Jonah. And Jonah actually wasn't even to the northern kingdom. They were talking about Babylon. He was a prophet, Babylon. And then during that time, in the northern kingdom, Joel and Micah were active in the northern kingdom. No, wait, in the southern kingdom. So number 6, the northern kingdom was defeated by Assyria and deported in 722. Okay, so that would be the Assyrian captivity. What you guys know of, probably familiar with in Daniel, is when Judah, 150 years later, was taken by the Babylonians, because the Babylonians took over Assyria eventually. And we will get onto that. That will be number 9, that we talk about Judah's kings with intermittent good and bad. And this will get us a more closely related. But right now, I want you guys to go to your groups and start your lesson. And your lesson is quickly going to give some background as to how those kingdoms split. Again, they'll be do what I just said. And then they're going to have you identify some of the kings and some of the prophets that were busy during those times before we go on to Amos, which will be the first prophet to the northern kingdom. I know that sounds all really crazy right now, but I wanted you to have this to refer back to it, and you've got charts and you'll have your lessons. And the Macs are really, really helpful, and we'll talk more about that. So if you feel that confused or overwhelmed, don't panic. It's going to all play itself out, and we just have to kind of dump it all at first, and then we're going to parse that out as it goes so that everybody understands the progression of it and why being products was so significant. So let's pray before you go. Father, I thank you that once again you see like history, and that you have your chosen people, Israel, are the ones you mostly revealed yourself through. And we want to know about that. We want to know what they did in response to you, and what you did in response to them, and how that worked out in their history so that we can learn from it. Because we want to serve you well. I thank you, Father, that your grace and your mercy covers when we fail, and that your spirit empowers us to walk forward and do it right. I pray that we will have focus for our world. We have a corrupt, evil society that we live in, and you have asked us to infiltrate that society and do good. So I pray, Father, that you give us all wisdom on what that looks like, and that studying these prophets at this time in Israel's history will help us to do that. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your word, and that you may just make it clear, and you give insight and discernment, expression and wisdom to us as we study this difficult time of history. In Jesus' name, amen.